Yeah, so CTI is a method of working with people who are vulnerable that focuses on transitional periods or periods in people's lives in which they're moving from one system to another, or sometimes moving from an institution to the community, homelessness into housing, other kinds of life transitions in which people need extra support to successfully navigate those transitions. And the idea is that if we can effectively build networks of people, as well as provide direct support during a transition period, a critical time, that their longer-term trajectory or outcome will be enhanced. So the logic is time-limited intervention leading to a better, a positive long-term outcome. And so the way we do that is through the establishment of a close working relationship between a CTI worker or a social worker and the client, and then a very focused set of actions to try to help people identify their most important needs, and then try to devise ways to connect the person with resources, both it could be resources that come from the social system or the institutional care system, or they could be resources that are found elsewhere in the community, what I would call informal supports. Mm-hmm. Try to identify those resources and connect the person to that network of resources, and then over time slowly withdraw as the worker from the relationship, and hopefully after the CTI relationship ends, these other resources are in place to help support the person going forward. So in our original work and most CTI programs that operate for the populations that we're serving, primarily people who have been chronically homeless, people who have mental disorders, sometimes substance abuse problems and other kinds of problems. Most of these programs are operating with a 9-month model, and from start to finish. There have been adaptations of CTI that have used shorter periods. So I'm aware of some 6-month programs, and even there's some brief models that are only, say, last for 3 months. Those tend to be working on transitions and with populations that are less complex, typically. But in all of these approaches, the same basic sequence of steps is followed. They're still using sort of 3 distinct phases of work. They're still working more intensively and then stepping back as the intervention proceeds, and then slowly withdrawing. So regardless of the duration, they tend to follow the same kind of trajectory. Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's how the model first developed. We were working in some large homeless shelters in New York, and working closely with people to help them get stabilized, help them get connected with resources, help them get benefits that they needed to get housing, and then in sort of a traditional way, we did this from the shelter, and then getting people ready to be able to move out into housing. And we sort of operated in the traditional way, which was we put those things in, helped put those things in place. We made up a discharge plan, for what was to follow, and then we wished people good luck and maybe had a little party for them and said goodbye. And what we found was, while that was effective for some people, for many people, that transition was not successful. So they got out there in their new place, and within not too long a period of time, they had run into problems, a variety of different kinds of problems, lost their housing, came back into the shelter system. So that was what kind of got us thinking, what's missing here? How could we improve our practice so that people do better once they're housed and back in the community? And so that's when we started. That was kind of the insight. Oh, this transition actually is a stressful time. It can be a risk period because people have to go somewhere new. They have to make new connections. They're losing the relationship that they may have established with the workers that they had in the shelter. If they had connections with friends or other people who were in the shelter with them or in the neighborhood, all those things were lost. So we realized, the transition period here is actually a stressful period, a critical period, a risk period. And then it also occurred to us that maybe we could help during the transition period, help them establish better sort of new connections. Yeah. So that's what got us thinking about trying to build an approach that focused on the transition period, to try to overcome the risk period and use it as an opportunity to build new connections. And it's interesting that, and this goes back quite a while, I think it's clear that this notion of providing better transitional care is actually now common in other systems. And you see that in the healthcare system, where there's more of an effort to focus on when people are hospitalized, say for chronic health conditions, either say psychiatric conditions or other kinds of health conditions. Hospitals are now starting to pay much more attention to how do you enhance the transitional period so that people can retain access to the kinds of treatment that they need once they leave. So it's a very, in retrospect, it's an obvious point, and it was an obvious gap, but I think it wasn't so clear to us at the time, and now it seems obvious. So the idea of trying to, and I think this is also a trend that we see in a variety of different sectors, where the effort is to try to intervene more earlier before and prevent sort of a cascade of negative outcomes. And so, I think it makes a lot of sense. I see it now in actually in the homeless services world. In the U.S., we see this move toward what's being called rapid rehousing. So the idea is when people are vulnerable or beginning to lose their housing, instead of waiting until that condition has progressed, people have been on the street a long time, people have been in the shelter a long time, and then you have to try to help them put their lives back together. The idea is to try to intervene very early in that process and get them quickly into housing with needed supports before they've kind of had to get settled into a homeless status or homeless shelter. And so CTI is being used in that context. Even earlier up the line in terms of the ladder of sort of cause. I'm aware of some work, for instance, also this is related to housing, where people who are at risk of losing housing because they're have a hoarding problem, which can can mean that the health department can come and force them out of their house, or the landlord can evict them because they're not taking care of the apartment that they live in, and they're collecting newspapers and and the like. I know about some organizations that are getting referrals into the organization from health inspectors or landlords who become aware that there's a person living in their unit who is at risk of eviction because of hoarding. But you could imagine other reasons why someone might be at risk of losing housing. And then that the organization is intervening using a CTI approach to try to help resolve that risk. So that would be an example of a more prevention-oriented time to intervene.
Yeah.
I think the challenge would be that the challenge is to be able to use data to identify both risk points, risk periods, and to identify populations or people who are at risk. So if you're a provider organization and you want to intervene, you know where to go, and you know who to try to engage in services, because I don't think that the CTI approach or any other prevention approach, it would be difficult to apply it globally. So you need to know kind of where to go and who to target. But I think it can make a lot of sense. But it would require real analysis, I think, to figure out where to put these services and how to identify the right people to work with. Right, you'd probably need to collaborate. You'd probably need to collaborate with different entities in the community to help assess where are those critical periods and in your community, and who is being affected, and how do you get real-time data to make that kind of outreach. That's the other thing, right? It would have to be timely. It doesn't help you if you find out 6 months later. It helps you only if you know at the right time, and you can mobilize your resources effectively at the right moment. I know about an effort that's beginning in Denmark, where there's been a fair amount of penetration of the CTI model. And in fact, I would say there's been more creativity around thinking through different populations and different transitions that the CTI model could be applied for. And that's the place where they've given some thought to, or they're planning this work with people, not so much people who are, as far as I understand, not so much people who have just lost a job, but people who have been unemployed for a long time and have had trouble getting into the labor force, because I guess they're able to identify people in those groups, and then to try to help them get the kinds of services and supports that they would need to both obtain employment and retain employment. And I guess the way I imagine, although I don't know what their experience has been, that might look different depending on the types of people who are in that group, and what their barriers are to employment, why they've become unemployed. Were they never in the workforce? Or were they people who had been working, but then for some reasons lost jobs and had trouble getting back? Does it have to do with disabilities? Does it have to do with family demands or disabilities among other family members. You know, it would depend, it would have to be individualized. You know, as I've said, what we, the logic behind CTI is to try to build as much support as possible from community resources external to, in addition to and external to the CTI worker, you know, so to try to identify those resources and supports in the community and mobilize them and help people make connections, both by intervening with the person to connect them, but also trying to work with those resources to make them, to open them up and make them available, and then to try to mediate between when necessary. So that's one thing we mean by community-based. And then we also mean, very literally, to do that effectively, the worker needs to get out of the office and get on the street and get into the community so that they are aware of what exists or what could exist, and that they're present to establish good working relationships with those resources in the community. Like you can't be effective doing that from your desk by making phone calls or looking at websites. You know, it requires being present. It also
connection
to make those connections, and also to observe how these connections and networks actually operate. You know, because what might sound good to you or look good on paper, you might get out there and you see, well, this isn't really a good option for my client, and you might understand why, or you might be able to see, well, what are some barriers here, and try to break them down. So we mean, I think, two things by community-based. We rely on the community to provide support, but we also want to work in the community in order to make those things a reality, and make it run. That's right. Yeah, because what we want is, and I guess this goes to your question about social inclusion. I mean, what we want, ideally, is for people to have those supports and those resources available, and for them to be included in the life of the community. That's our goal, right? We don't want
long-term independence or dependence.
Yeah, and we don't want people to need to be long-term dependent for the long term on us as the worker. We want them to be interdependent with the broader community at large.